So they certainly talked about the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline at the Special Chiefs meeting in Gatineau today. The BC government continuing to oppose the project while the federal and Alberta governments continuing to support it. There is also disagreement among Indigenous communities. Kinder Morgan says it has signed benefits agreements with 43 Indigenous communities along the proposed route, but several other First Nations are challenging the approval process, and we certainly heard some of that today at the special meeting in Gatineau. Let's bring in our panel. They represent both sides. In Calgary, Stephen Buffalo is the president and CEO of the Indian Resource Council. And in Ottawa, BC Chief Judy Wilson with the Neskonlith Indian Band and executive member to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having me today.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
Judy, Stephen, let me start with you. You are for this pipeline expansion project. Why?
Well, you know, we're for with some conditions that our Section 35 rights are definitely looked after, and if there's a economic opportunity that, you know, under the Section 35 that we can continue to participate. And
what is Section 35 for our audience?
It's under the Constitution of the Indian Act, and, you know, acknowledging our treaty rights. So we conditionally kind of support it to the fact that, you know, the Indian Resource Council represents oil and gas producing First Nations, and you know, they supplement the lack of funding that they receive from the Indian Affairs under the Indian Act, and of course, you know, with oil and gas in the area, well, you know, they definitely take advantage of that to
right. So you want to make sure there's payment to the First Nations who are affected by it.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
You know, with saying that though, you know, obviously we respect and we support the ones that are obviously against this infrastructure project, because their rights have been violated, and it has to deal with the consultation issue and understanding the treaty rights and their rights that they, you know, weren't properly met with and didn't meet those consultation guidelines.
Okay, Judy, you're against this. Why?
The Kinder Morgan expansion traverses about 500 kilometers through our territory in the Squamish Nation, and we have like proper title holders that haven't given consent and will not give consent to this pipeline. That's not speaking of the bands who are under federal jurisdiction and have only the reserves that they speak to, and the inherent title rights are the proper title holders. So that's been missing out of what has been discussed.
Okay.
And also the federal government nor the provincial government can speak to those inherent title and rights. We have unceded, unsold, and unrelinquished lands in our territory, so they cannot speak for those, and we hold the underlying title, so that's the other missing fact a lot of people aren't getting.
So you're saying they need your permission to do
well,
this?
The consent is needed under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's international law. And also the federal government is saying they're implementing that, they're embracing that, and they're not telling the truth, and they're lying if they say they can, in one hand, accept the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and have a relationship with Indigenous people respectfully, and then on the other hand, try to push through a major pipeline like that without the proper consent.
Okay, Stephen, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. You know, again, you know, that's one of the biggest underlying issues. You know, the rights aren't being acknowledged, and of course, you know, the previous government that had changed the environmental policy, which are now coming into effect, that, you know, they wanted to get this project done, and you can see the economics behind it. But if you're not including First Nations and you have no consent to have that access to the communities, well, of course, you know, all First Nations will stand behind that. You know, the valuation of Aboriginal title and Indigenous right is something that we're working hard on, the Indian Resource Council of Canada, to ensure that, you know, that the First Nations rights are met, and as well, you know, that the project can continue to go through.
Okay,
but
so
you know,
that,
until First Nations are invited to the table to at least be part of the discussion, that's where things really need to start.
Okay, so I understand where you agree on this, and I also know where you disagree on this, and that's on the environment versus the economy. We'll talk about that in a second, but the government would say, and I've had Bill Morneau on my program in the past, who's insisted that First Nations in this country were consulted. Judy, what do you say to that?
Well, in his version, consultation is very different than consent. And the international law is changing now in the landscape of the legal side and the technical side. So those conditions were not met at all. So he needs to go back and find out what that means. It's not consultation in Canada anymore with Indigenous people. It's called consent. That's the new standard. And the other thing is there's 17 First Nations in court. And also there's been a call by the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh on investigating the federal approval of this pipeline. So there's a lot more to look at than mere consultation. That's not the proper process anymore. There's new laws, there's Constitution, and the United Nations Declaration around that issue.
Okay, Stephen, do you agree with that? It's not about consultation, it's about obtaining consent?
A bit of both. You know, consultation can be like it has different interpretations. Industry has its interpretation, the federal and provincial governments have their interpretation, and of course our communities have their interpretation. And we have to fully go into dialogue into that and kind of discuss it further to achieve consent. You know, again, you know, at the end of the day, it comes down to, I think, to the bottom line as to what's being offered. And what's the acceptance model going forward, eh? But again, if we can't get to the table, First Nations can't be at the table when these discussions begin, then yeah, it's very tough to move things forward along.
Judy, let me ask you what consent looks like, because as you know, there's division within First Nations already about this, within the Indigenous community already about this. Some are fully on board and others are not. So what would qualify as consent? 100% agreement, a majority, a referendum within? What would be your answer to that? What does that look like?
Well, really the division is being caused by the government, and the division is being caused by Kinder Morgan itself. This is the old divide and conquer tactics. Our people should be well aware of them by now. This has happened since the first settlers came to Canada. They're trying to divide our people. And with Indigenous people, we have the inherent title and rights, but we also have inherent responsibilities to care for the water, the land, the plants, the animals. You know, and it's a tipping point with global warming right now and climate change. We have to all be conscious of that, and the dependency that we have on oil and gas. Well, we have to be looking at more sustainable energy and more sustainable solutions that are long-term, because you know, we all know, you know, there's a destructive path for the exploitation of extractive resources. So that's another day, another big issue to deal with. But the word consent means in our processes, international law is very clear about free, prior, informed consent. So, you know, that's right in the United Nations Declaration. But there's also the Indigenous people's view of consent, where the water has a say, the Mother Earth has a say, the plants and the animals have a say. It isn't just big industry that has a say, or the government looking for big tax dollars or big dollars to come through to have a say, because those resources and the title belong to our people, and we have to manage that for future generations. And that's not being considered. I think it's being very short-sighted of government and industry to try to ram this major pipeline project through our territories. And they're going to create these man camps, and our Secwepemc women warriors are standing up saying no to the man camps, and our Union of BC Indian Chiefs supported that declaration opposing those man camps or Kinder Morgan in our Secwepemc territory, because that brings another dimension of violence against our people, and we don't want it in our territory.
Okay, so you listed a lot of things there. I want to get a sense of where your boundary is on this, Judy. Is it because of the environment, even if the titles and everything else could be worked out, would you be opposed to the expansion of this pipeline?
Well, it's what I just talked about with climate change and global warming. We have to look at, as a country, as Canadians, as citizens, alternative paths, like to the energy, to the economy. There's a tipping point, and it's happening now. I
Okay.
called today, there's a tipping point in our reconciliation era, but it's also a tipping point for our environment and our climate and our Mother Earth and our planet and globally.
All right.
We have to change how we're thinking about things, and we
Okay.
keep investing in fossil fuel and oil extractive mining and oil industries. That's a one-way path. There's been many studies on this. Canada
Okay.
missed its target on emissions and climate change, and so did the province of BC.
Yeah. I just want to take it
we
to-
have some serious issues here.
I understand. Just want to, Stephen, I'll give you the last word on this. We've heard from lots of people on the programs on CBC and elsewhere who said that they also feel like they owe their children, to relieve their financial burden as well, if they can. There's another point of view here.
Right. Their connection to the land is very sacred and going forward. But at the same sense, though, we have problems in our communities where we're struggling. So, from the Indian Resource Council point of view, is that, if there's an economic opportunity, then, we have to investigate that thoroughly. And so when the government of Alberta stepped up and said they'd be a major investor into that project, of course, I'm sure I'm not the only one that perked up and said, well, how do First Nations be a part of that? And of course, again, looking at not only from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, our regulations in those areas are world class. So when we do resources extraction and what have you, it costs money to protect the environment, and that's what I'll say about that. But in the same sense, we can have that economic and environmental balance moving forward. I'm not a scientist nor an engineer, but I know the research that I've done that some of these initiatives moving forward, you got to investigate before you kind of say things in regards to the climate and what have you. But at the end of the day, though, our people are still in almost some of our communities are in third world conditions. So if there's an economic opportunity, and that's all we're investigating here in support of, that's what we have to look forward to. But again, it doesn't happen if we're on the outside looking in. When the leaders sit down, the premiers and the prime minister, and First Nations aren't at the table, well, yeah, you're going to get a lot of class action lawsuits on consultation and Indigenous land and title rights because, again, we're just simply not there. So
All right.
I hope going forward that, Minister Carr, the finance minister and Justin Trudeau can see that and then eventually let some of our community leaders at least come and speak for themselves.
All right.
and try to settle this that way. So.
All right. Stephen Buffalo, President of the Indian Resource Council, and Judy Wilson, Chief of the Nisconlith Indian Band. Thank you both so much for joining me tonight.